So I think failures are important, especially in our profession, in our business, and not to brag, but product engineering knows a lot about failures because we fail a lot. Every model that comes to this plant is the product of many design failures and subsequent fixes, hopefully. Through the course of producing a new model, testing and prototyping, we uncovered tons of issues. Many of you guys help us find these issues. But failure doesn't just happen in design, right? Design is just easier for me to talk about, so honestly, we're going to be focusing on a lot of that today. But generally, learning from failures applies to everything: business, engineering, leadership, social failures, whatever. So think about the context that you know best. So I think what we need to start with is how we react to failure. Like, what do people do when things fail? First, our emotions kick in, right? We feel ashamed, we feel frustrated. Generally, it's a negative reaction towards failure. We deny failures, we hide them, we cover them up, and then we start blaming, right? This is the Tacoma Narrows bridge collapse. You guys might be familiar with the image. This is back in 1940. And this is a pretty good example of a blame game. I think you can probably find the blame game just about anywhere there's any sort of failure. But Clark Eldridge was the lead project engineer for the bridge project. And as soon as it failed, he couldn't help but start pointing fingers away from himself. In the newspaper, like the following day, he was quoted saying, "We were told we couldn't have the necessary money without using plans furnished by an Eastern firm of engineers chosen by the money lenders." So he's already pointing the fingers all over the place. This type of finger pointing isn't helpful, but it's very common. We just instinctually start pointing fingers. And you can find this, as I said, about after any sort of failure. I know I've done it. I'm sure you all have caught yourself doing it too. It's human nature. It's something we got to move beyond, because my main goal today is for everyone to shift their mindset. I'm not going to tell you that failures are fun. They're not. But there's almost always an opportunity. That is, as long as we choose to see it. See, failure is a key form of feedback. And feedback is important to any system. We all operate within systems of some sort. Business systems, engineering systems, manufacturing, management, social systems. And if you kind of break it up into two key systems, you have open loop and closed loop systems. This is super simplified, but an open loop system, you should have an input, some sort of process occurs on an input, and you get an output. A closed loop system is where the magic happens. This is where we want to be in our systems. Basically, there is some sort of variable measured on the output. That variable gets processed and fed back into the input or into the process to improve systems, to improve the system, to improve the performance of the system, and ultimately create a better output. So that error, which is failure, is essentially the key to that stable closed loop system. Fortunately, a lot of things we do in all of our systems operate in an open loop. A good way to visualize open loop is basically with ballistics. Many business failures actually can be attributed to kind of this ballistic model. If you think about how these guys operated and try to draw some parallels to maybe how some of our projects get handled. These guys identified a target really far away. They might not be able to see the target, just as we do when we're starting a new project out, right? We have some goal that we're looking for way in the future, and you have to make some assumptions in order to get there. These guys made assumptions on wind, humidity, muzzle velocity, drag, and then they calculated their trajectories or made their plans for hitting their targets, just like we do with making plans for our projects. You angle the barrel and you fire and you start the project. But the world's complicated, right? We likely didn't make the right assumptions on certain things. The shell is going to be heading out of the barrel and it's going to move off course a little bit. First, maybe a little, and then more and more. Maybe the target moves while the shell's in the air. Maybe the target was never in the spot we thought it was, and we ultimately missed the mark despite our best efforts. The path of the shell is basically an open loop. It doesn't take into account any of that error as it's going through its path. Once it's released, it might as well just be a rock flying through the air, right? The point is we don't want our projects to do this. It's vital to react to whatever happens to our projects or the missile or the shell after we pull the trigger and launch them. So the better metaphor for us to think about is a guided missile, where it launches in the general direction it's trying to go, and through the course of its travel, it's making thousands of tiny corrections to try to finally hone in, get a lot closer to that target than a shell might. So this is, if we miscalculated some of those assumptions early on, we want our project to be able to account for those things and redirect. We want to make those corrections mid-flight and actively react to the error and failures. As far as anthropologists can tell, the first closed-loop development cycle basically started 1.7 million years ago by our ancestor Homo ergaster, which was a cousin of Homo erectus. They started developing what's called the Acheulean hand axe, which you can see here. They basically started putting sharp edges on and points on rocks. And this allowed them to perform basic tasks with a pretty simple tool. The sharp end was obviously the business end. The curved end didn't hurt the hand, and you're actually basically doing whatever you need to do with it. And they failed sometimes when they made these, and they learned from those failures. And they taught each other how to make them better. And over time, they developed. It's a very slow development cycle, but they did develop and make them better. And this cycle basically set humanity on a different path. Margaret Mead is a cultural anthropologist, and she said, man's most human characteristic is not his ability to learn, which he shares with many other species, but his ability to teach and store what others have developed and taught him. So it's not necessarily the development of the hand axe that was key. The hand axe was just evidence that early man had started sharing their ideas, sharing their failures, and improving upon those. All human knowledge is essentially accrued from failure. Our knowledge keeps continuing to build and evolve over generations. The derricks are basically like the hand axe, just a more evolved version of it, right? This was a very early version of a derrick a long time ago. Learned from a lot of those failures, right? And subsequently through the years, we've got to what we think now is the state of the art. But obviously, 50 years from now, we're going to be looking back at this the same way we're looking at this derrick. This ability to teach and learn and not repeat the same errors is really what's spurred the explosion of humanity. I ran across this quote by Ronald Reagan recently. I think it's like my favorite quote on failure. In America, we learn from our setbacks as well as our successes. And although the lessons of failure are hard, they're often the most important on the road to progress. Because we don't hide our mistakes, we're not condemned to repeat them. And I think this is a really important thing. He's talking here about the Challenger disaster. This was a few months after that occurred. And so I figured this would be a good case study on failure for us to take a look at. For those of you that are not familiar with this, there's actually a pretty good documentary on Netflix. It's maybe a little dramatic, but it still goes into some good details. I'll take some of the high points here if anyone's not familiar. The overnight temperature before the launch day itself was 22 degrees Fahrenheit in Florida, so way outside the norm. Because of this, the booster engineers in particular had some major concerns, but NASA management basically pressed ahead, tried to push through all roadblocks for a launch. They had already had, I think, a couple of weeks worth of delays for other reasons, and so they were trying to bulldoze ahead because other than the temperature, it was a beautiful day. The booster O-ring failed immediately upon liftoff, and that led to catastrophic failure 73 seconds into flight. Reagan then formed the Rogers Commission to investigate. Their report blamed a few key things. The most obvious, obviously, is launching outside of that performance window that they're used to, especially despite major opposition from the booster engineers. We've had some inklings of idea that this might be a problem. Part of that was that they basically had this confirmation bias. I think bias is an important thing for anyone who's making decisions. So we might hit a couple of things about bias here, but they basically went into the go, no-go meeting with prove that we shouldn't fly this mission, where in reality they needed to have the mindset of prove that we should fly. Where's the evidence that supports that this would be a safe thing, especially because they're so far outside of normal performance windows. The other big thing, this is probably the biggest thing that the Rogers Commission mentioned, was they had four years of flights prior to this that had evidence of sealed issues that ultimately didn't, at that point, lead to any sort of real failure. And so there's this normalization of deviance. Normalization of deviance is the process in which deviation from normal behavior or rule becomes normal over time. And I think this term is especially important for us because I think we all deal with the effects of this, whether it's quality, safety, engineering, pencil whipping checklists, even in our own personal lives. I think we all need to be aware of these effects because it's very real. So let's look a little bit at that normalization of deviance. This is probably getting a little bit too in the weeds, but I think it's worth looking at. This is the data from the boosters on all the 24 previous launches. So each pair here represents a single launch, and the O-ring joints that we're talking about are these three lines in the middle here. And so the marks that are on these lines basically are just visual representations of different kinds of evidence they found of failures of the O-rings that didn't ultimately result in a catastrophic failure, but they were localized failures. These were basically the canaries in the coal mine that were shoved under the rug. There was development efforts to try to address some of this stuff, but it was never adequately prioritized at the booster manufacturer, because at this point, nothing has happened. You can kind of see here some pictures here too. This is right after liftoff. You can see the combustion gas is actually escaping out of that O-ring joint. And then this is right before the catastrophic failure, where you got a fireball basically blowing out the side of the booster. They didn't see the data they needed because they weren't looking for failure. They were looking for success. And I think Warren Buffett states it well. He's talking about the business world, but I think it applies to everything. The rearview mirror is always clearer than the windshield. And I think, as I said, it's true in just about any environment, especially when you're dealing with failures. Hindsight's always 20/20, right? Hindsight on the Challenger is that those O-ring failures early on were actually really significant. Those were the canaries that they just didn't pay attention to. It's really hard to predict what's going to occur before it occurs. But there is a way to kind of use this hindsight. And I think this is a really interesting tool that I've heard mentioned a couple of times that I think is worth talking about. It's called a pre-mortem meeting. It essentially provides windshield wipers to Buffett's metaphor. Has anyone heard of a post-mortem meeting? I don't have to cover that then. This is a pre-mortem meeting. And so I'll kind of cover what the details of this are. It's at the beginning of the project or near the beginning of the project. And the project manager sits down with the team and basically says, hey, I've got this crystal ball and I'm looking into it and I can see the future, the end of this project, and it is a colossal failure. We're not selling any machines, or maybe a machine broke, or we're having issues with production. There's a myriad of issues that could be. So what could it be? And the power here is that it puts everyone's mind into the idea of, wow, this thing has failed. You're basically leveraging the idea in your brain, putting your brain in that mode of failure, and then trying to work backwards and like, all right, what could the failures be? Apparently, you come up with very specific and actionable issues that are real risks to the project. This allows you to basically try to identify what those real risks are and actually do something about them in your project plan. So this allows people to voice some more specific concerns. This is kind of in contrast to what NASA did with the Challenger launch, where we're looking for potential failures here, where they were looking for a launch. Because if you guys remember, failure is an opportunity, and identifying possible failure provides us with opportunities for success. So given the power of failures, I think we maybe have recognized that at this point, why do we react the way we do to failure? I think in a single word, it's related to anxiety and stress. And a lot of that comes from evolution of our biological systems. Back when our ancestors were hunter-gatherers, failure was often linked to death. If you're hunting a lion and you fail, you're probably dead. You're probably good meat. And then likewise, there's this defensiveness to when you do survive a failure and everyone's pointing the finger at you and you get exiled from your clan, that also leads to death. And so there was a lot of pressure evolutionarily to create a lot of fear and anxiety in our biological systems because it was essentially self-preservation. The world's different now, though, and so we need to lean into failures, kind of like the way the military did back in World War II. If anyone's familiar with this, don't speak out. But back in World War II, the military is losing bombers left and right. Especially in Europe, it was basically statistically impossible for a bomber crew to complete a 25-mission tour. And so, rightfully so, the military wanted to try to reinforce these planes, armor the planes, but you can't armor everything because of weight concerns. And so they set out to try to study where the bullets were most likely to hit. So on every returning bomber, they had a crew basically climb over this thing and graph out where all the bullet holes were. Because they wanted to try to figure out where the bullet holes were hitting so that they could armor those locations. And so by studying these failures, they knew exactly where the planes were getting hit and subsequently where to put the armor, right? Put them where the bullet holes are. Wrong. Luckily, there was a smart mathematician. His name was Abraham Ball. And he looked at this and he realized we were wrong. There was a strong bias going on here called survivorship bias. So where do we actually need the armor?
Everywhere where the bullets are the whole time.
Right. So you kind of have to assume bullets were kind of breaking these things evenly up. And so the areas that you weren't seeing bullet holes in the returning planes meant that a bullet hole there meant a crash. So there's a lot we can learn from failure as long as we look at it right. We have to make sure that we're looking at it objectively. Another thing we can learn from failures is we kind of study how different cultures and industries approach failure. I think this is a pretty incredible graph. This is commercial aviation fatalities over time. Back in the 70s, aviation and the FAA, aviation had a lot of failures, and the FAA and the aviation industry was essentially afraid they wouldn't have a job if they continued on the trajectory they had. And so something needed to change. If they didn't reduce the crashes, they were basically afraid people just wouldn't fly anymore. Since then, aviation has really worked hard to change their culture. And I think the results are staggering. We take aviation safety for granted now, but it was a lot of hard work, especially back in the 70s and 80s. They've forcefully changed their approach to failure. This quote by Eleanor Roosevelt, I think, highlights aviation's new culture pretty well. Learn from the mistakes of others. You can't live long enough to make them all yourself. And I think the aviation industry has truly embraced this. Back in the 70s, aviation and healthcare really weren't much different as far as their cultures go. And so in some reading, there's a lot of comparing and contrasting between these two. In aviation today, they have a very open learning culture around errors and failures. There's only about 250 deaths per year in the US. There's this really open two-way communication between pilots and leaders, and there's a lack of blame, right? There's a whole system in the FAA to report close calls and near incidents, that sort of thing, and there's like a rule in there that pilots can't be blamed for stuff that they report. In contrast, in healthcare, there's a very closed culture about errors. It's even really hard to make estimates on the number of deaths due to medical error, but the best estimates range from 15,000 to 200,000 a year in the US. There's also apparently a very big hierarchy between hospital administrators and hospital caregivers, and there's generally kind of a lack of accountability for these major errors that occur. Sully Sullenberger, the pilot of the Miracle on the Hudson flight, I think he does a good job of summarizing the culture in aviation also. He says, "We've purchased these lessons at great cost. Lessons have been literally bought with blood that we have to pass on to succeeding generations. We cannot have the moral failure of forgetting these lessons and have to relearn them. Basically, they recognize the value behind these lessons, the failures, and relating them to lessons bought with blood is a pretty strong relationship there. So they really value this stuff a lot. And it really comes down to kind of two cultures. We talked about accountability versus blame. These are two general cultures you'll find across different industries. In the accountability culture, people are seen as problem solvers. Problems are seen as learning opportunities. There's this kind of mentality that we're all still learning, right? So you make mistakes, we're all still learning from them. And if you do make a mistake or failures, there's a focus on what is wrong versus who is wrong. There's basically fact-finding missions. And generally, you've got this growth mindset. We'll cover mindsets here in a minute. In the blame cultures, people are seen as the problem. Problems are seen as headaches. Admitting weaknesses can be seen as career limiting instead of opportunities. There's a focus on who is wrong. Instead of fact-finding, you're trying to find fault, point fingers, and generally they've got this fixed mindset. Accountability cultures essentially see that failure is an opportunity. So then on a more personal side of it, we kind of get to this mindset of it. People with growth mindset embrace failure. At least they try to. As I said, failure is never fun, but you got to recognize that it's an opportunity, as we talked about. Growth mindset people learn from feedback, they learn from that criticism. They operate in the closed loop that we talked about, where you're taking in that feedback and putting that back into how you operate. Intelligence and talent is seen as something that's developed, and they persist in the face of failures. Whereas people with a fixed mindset avoid failure. They try not to do risky things. They're defensive too. They ignore criticism. They operate in the open loop, where you're basically ignoring all sorts of feedback into the way you operate. Intelligence and talent is seen as a natural trait. So you're like, I was born being smart, or I was born being dumb. And they believe that they are a failure when they fail. I think a really good example of that growth mindset in leadership is a quote from Thomas Watson, who's an early CEO of IBM. He said, "Recently, I was asked if I was going to fire an employee who made a mistake that cost the company $600,000, which is a long time ago, a lot of money. No," I replied, "I just spent $600,000 training him. Why would I want someone else to hire his experience?" So let's contrast that now with a very fixed mindset in leadership. Transocean is the company that owns the Deepwater Horizon. In their 2010 annual report, they claimed that 2010 was their safest year in company history. That was the same year that 11 died, an oil rig sank to the bottom of the Gulf, and they dumped 210 million gallons of crude. So maybe statistically it was their safest year in history, but they squarely blame this whole failure on BP and basically wash their hands of it. So it's a very fixed mindset. Our ability to learn from failures really depends on what psychologists call learning environments. There's kind of a spectrum here, but we'll talk about the extremes. There's kind learning environments and wicked learning environments. And I think obviously we'd all like to think that we work in and encourage kind learning environments, but it's not up to us necessarily. This term isn't about how kind we are to each other. It's basically up to our problem sets and the realities of the world. A kind learning environment is very much like this little girl learning to kick a soccer ball. It's a very controlled environment. There's instant feedback on how she kicks the ball. She can vary how she kicks it. It goes one way or the other, and she's quickly learning how to hone it in to put it in the right direction. It's also really easy to determine success or failure. It happens instantly. It either goes in the goal or it doesn't. So in a kind learning environment, you can rapidly change these inputs and then understand the outputs. It's a simple closed loop system, right? So kind learning environments have this rapid and clear feedback cycle that give people the opportunity to learn from their errors and failures. Let's contrast that now with a wicked learning environment. They're complex problems, complex systems. There may be huge delays in time between your inputs and your outputs, which makes it really hard to figure out what input resulted in what output. They may have feedback, but it might not be very clear, right? There's some question marks there. It might be really delayed, or you might not have any feedback at all. They're complex problems. There's also low repetition on some of these, where it's really difficult for one person to gain first-hand experience. And ultimately, that early feedback you do get may be completely unclear, kind of like we talked about. It may also be misleading. So here's some pretty good examples of some real-world wicked learning environments. With the Potomac Narrows Bridge, think about the time between design and build of a bridge. With the Flint water crisis, that's the middle image there. How often is someone turning on a new water source? Maybe once in a career. It's hard to identify all the factors that could be going into that. In addition to that, apparently a lot of the early warning signs that they had on this were pretty unclear. It was hard to tell whether it was groundwater was coming from some internal issue in people's homes, it was coming from the main water source. And then the Challenger, obviously, the early feedback with those O-rings was not exactly clear. So the paradox of success is that it's built on failures. And this is basically the key for just about any success, is that they're all built on failures of some sort. Thomas Edison failed, he says, 10,000 times while developing the light bulb. James Dyson failed 5,127, very specific, 5,127 times while developing the cyclone vacuum. The Potomac Narrows Bridge collapse led to better understanding of aerodynamics, bridge design. The Flint water crisis exposed the problem of water quality in many cities across the country. The space shuttle boosters were subsequently redesigned, and they made 110 successful launches without any sort of evidence of O-ring failure. And thanks to the aviation culture today, you have better odds of being struck by lightning 7 times than being in an airline crash. So how can we do a better job of building upon failures in order to find success? This is basically a summary of everything we've talked through, but I'm going to hit them just to go through one more time. That pre-mortem meeting is, I think, pretty important because it gives you that perspective hindsight, gives you that ability to kind of look into the rearview mirror, even though there's nothing back there. Utilize closed loop systems as much as you can. Try not to follow that ballistic model. Really try to make sure you're thinking about making adjustments as you're going through your project path as many times as you can to try to keep you on track. Don't see those adjustments as pains. Recognize they're just part of the process. And recognize, as I said, recognize those early errors as key pieces of feedback. If you're having errors early on in your process, you're absolutely going to be plagued by them if you don't address them early on. Be aware of your cognitive biases. We talked about confirmation bias, survivorship bias. There's that plan continuation bias. There's tons of biases. There could probably be a whole presentation on the number of cognitive biases we have. When you do have a problem, try to set up a kinder learning environment if you can. Get rid of those variables. It's going to help really figure out what the solution to that problem is. And then ultimately, the big thing here is just value failures and ultimately communicate them to the team. Check your mindset. Is it fixed or growth? So who here has failed? Okay, I'm glad to see every hand raised here. Because failures are opportunities in disguise. None of us are perfect. We all fail. We're all human. And I think with the right mindset, the right tools, and the right approach about failure, sharing our lessons with each other, we can ultimately all learn from it. And so if anyone's interested in this topic, in more depth in this topic, I highly recommend these 2 books. Black Box Thinking may be my new favorite book. They're both on Audible too, which is a plus. And here's basically where I'd like to try to open up some discussion.